Welcome back. Now, I know I left you last time with a cliffhanger. I did that intentionally. I wanted to make sure you'd come back. I know that last time I told you about the discovery of the tomb, but we never really got to Tutankhamun and who he is. We had just traced Carter and Carnarvon opening the tomb, and I'd mentioned that the mummy of Tutankhamun was still inside. Let me take us further inside the tomb. It was an interesting partnership, this Carter and Carnarvon. Carter was a bit rough around the edges. Remember, Lady Amherst sent him out because he was not a gentleman. Carnarvon, of course, was just the opposite. Owned racing horses, lived at Highclere Castle, wealthy, and very sophisticated. Now, the two of them made a decision that I think they would eventually regret. They didn't want to be bothered by the press. You've got the first intact Pharaoh's tomb in the Valley of the Kings. It was a sensation. And they were worried that the press would distract them, slow down their work. So they made a decision that they would sell the rights to the story of Tutankhamun's tomb to one British newspaper, the London Times. So they sold the rights to only one newspaper. What that meant was they would talk only to the correspondent from that newspaper. And in essence, the Egyptian journalists were locked out. The Egyptian journalists couldn't cover the discovery in their own country. So there was a tremendous amount of bad feeling. This is colonialism at its worst. They didn't do it for the money because they wanted the money for the rights. They just didn't want to be bothered with the press. But it was a bad decision, creating bad feelings. You'll see. But they continued to excavate. They cleared the antechamber with all of those objects that I mentioned, the funeral couches and all kinds of things. Interestingly, by the way, it's the first time we get an idea of what is a king buried with. One of the things he's buried with is oil. Sacred oil. There were something like 67 alabaster jars full of sacred oil. When you were buried with the 7 sacred oils. There were 7 sacred oils used in mummification. They were used in cosmetics. And these were very valuable, precious, and you needed them for the next world. Because remember, you're going to take it all with you, right? You can get up and go again in the next world. Remember, the Egyptians were resurrectionists, not reincarnationists. They believed that the body was going to resurrect in the next world, not come back to this earth in another form or something like that. So that's why the pharaoh's tombs are packed with everything. The next world will be a continuation of this one. So there was oils, right? Loads of oils. There were chariots, Tutankhamun's chariots, thrones, his baby throne. He became king when he was 10 years old. It's a little baby throne. All kinds of wonderful things. But I will tell you the strangest thing about the tomb, and you'll see why in a minute. Nothing in the tomb ever said who Tutankhamun's father was or who his mother was. Nothing. In the end, after Carter had cleared everything out of the tomb, and this is now the 1930s. It took that long to clear the tomb. Carter said, in the end, Tutankhamun escaped me. He still didn't know anything about Tutankhamun. You'll see why. But they excavate, and they keep taking things out, and they're photographing. It's a difficult excavation, because things are piled up. For example, sometimes wooden objects had to be conserved before they could be moved, or else they'd crumble to dust. Carter wired to America, saying he needed help. He wired to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the Metropolitan said, we will give you our photographer, Harry Burton. They had a photographer. They were excavating the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and Burton was the greatest archaeological photographer, and Burton became the photographer for Howard Carter. So all those wonderful pictures of the tomb from the 1920s are all by Harry Burton, from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So they're photographing, they're recording, doing everything as carefully as they can. And finally, they get to the burial chamber. Will Tutankhamun be there? Nobody's sure even. Nobody's sure. It's a small room, maybe something like 14 feet square. And when they open it, the amazing thing is they look in and they see a gold wall. They can't see anything else. There are no objects, just a gold wall. They're looking through this hole. And what it was, a golden shrine. Now, it's not solid gold. It's wood that's been gilded. And it's a large shrine that takes up almost the entire room, floor to ceiling. There's only about 2 or 3 feet between the shrine and the wall all around it. And it's a very difficult problem. How do you excavate this? The shrine was built inside the room in pieces, and it won't fit out, of the wall through the wall, the hole they've made. So they've got to take it apart. Now, the problem for Carter is when the wood shrine was put inside the tomb, it was fresh wood. It was strong. It was solid. He's now dealing with wood that's 3,300 years old, and he's got to take it apart without breaking it. There's another problem. The workmen didn't follow the instructions. Sometimes workmen do that, I hear. The shrine came labeled. You know how when you get a kit, sometimes it says insert tab A in slot A? The shrine had written on it, in ink, instructions for the workmen. One side says front, another side says rear. So the lid, front and rear, and then on the side it says front and rear, and then on the other side it says front and rear, so you know not to mess it up. You know how it fits in. Well, they got a couple of them turned around. They didn't follow the instructions. Maybe they couldn't read. Maybe they didn't know what they were doing. But it was jammed on, and it was very, very hard for Carter to remove the shrine. But he did, working under terrible conditions. So he removes the gold shrine, takes it apart, and brings it out through the hole they've made into the burial chamber. Inside it is another gold shrine. They remove that one, it's smaller, and inside that is another gold shrine. Now, interesting, the shrines didn't have any floors. So in other words, they rest right on the tomb floor. They would find out why. So the shrines are now removed, and they have reached the sarcophagus. At this point, they knew they had an intact tomb. They knew it, because the last shrine was sealed. The bolts were still shut. Nobody had entered. They were going to get Tutankhamun. So now they're at the sarcophagus, right? Okay, you've got a stone sarcophagus, and you have to raise the lid. Problem. Every step of the way is a problem for Carter. The problem is the lid had been cracked in antiquity and had been patched, repaired, and painted over to look like it wasn't cracked. So if you lifted it, it might break. So they very carefully, they get the ropes under it, they get the chains under it, they lift it, and then disaster strikes. As I said, there was a lot of bad feeling about Carter, Carnarvon giving it only to the English papers. Carter and Carnarvon had had an official opening for the wives of the excavators, the wives of the team, most of whom were Brits, most were British, and no Egyptians were invited. A real faux pas. This infuriated the Egyptian press, infuriated them. Carter said, we can't work under these conditions of everybody visiting the tomb. And Carter went on strike, right? Leaving the lid of the sarcophagus suspended. The Egyptian government retaliated by locking Carter and Carnarvon out of the tomb, saying, this is our tomb. And the lid is left hanging over the sarcophagus. Eventually, it was ironed out. It was finally ironed out. I think the Egyptian government realized that Carter was the only man who could really excavate it. He was a skilled excavator. I think Carter probably realized his errors, and the excavation went on. But in the interim, Lord Carnarvon dies. Now, you have all heard about the curse of Tutankhamun, the curse of King Tut. I think the reason for the curse, this myth of the curse, is that Carter and Carnarvon weren't giving interviews to any newspapers besides the London Times. The newspapers had nothing to write about. They had to make up something. And as soon as Carnarvon died, it was the curse of Tutankhamun. And they started saying all kinds of things. Now, we know how Carnarvon died. He died of an infected mosquito bite in Cairo. He was shaving. He cut himself with his razor, became infected, and he died. So, no curse. And it's not true that many people died soon after him. No. A typical random sampling of people in the tomb died. So, there was no curse, but I think it was a result of the reporters not having anything to write about. So Carnarvon dies, and Carter must press on by himself, finally excavating the tomb. Inside the sarcophagus were 3 nested sarcophagi. And Carter has a great deal of difficulty getting them out. They are a tight fit, very tight fit, with pins closing them, has to saw them open, you know. They're coffins that are gilded. And then they get to the last one. They're lifting the lids, and they get to the last one. And inside is Tutankhamun. On the day of burial, as he was left, the first time you see a pharaoh intact, in his coffin, in his tomb. At first, they didn't know what they were looking at. There was a gauze over the face, and they weren't sure. It looked like it was blurred. Then they removed the gauze, and then they saw, of course, that fabulous golden coffin. Now, this is why there was no floor to the shrines. The last coffin, the third innermost coffin, was solid gold, 250 pounds of gold. It was incredibly heavy, and they had trouble lifting it. They didn't know why it was so heavy. But the problem they had immediately confronting them was how to get Tutankhamun out of the coffin. He's in this gold coffin, but he's stuck in it. On the day of burial, they poured sacred oils on Tutankhamun. Those oils had congealed over 3,300 years, and it was now like tar. He was stuck. And they didn't know how to get him out. They tried all kinds of things. You wouldn't believe what they tried. You would not believe it. They took it outside and left it in the sun, hoping that the sun would soften it. It didn't. Carter created zinc plates, put it underneath the coffin, and with a blowtorch, put a blowtorch to the zinc plates so the coffin wouldn't melt, and tried to heat it. It didn't work. Eventually, they had to chip Tutankhamun out of the coffin. Had to chip him out of the coffin. Now, this is the first point where we get the mummy of Tutankhamun. And as I said, I think what we learn from the mummy of Tutankhamun is even more interesting than what we learn from the objects in the tomb. Let me explain, and let me start with a disclaimer. What I'm going to do in this lecture is present an archaeological theory. It's my theory. It is not proven. That's why I call it a theory. But I think it's the best explanation for the facts we have. Many Egyptologists agree with it. Many disagree. We're divided. And it's just a theory. But the theory is that Tutankhamun was murdered. And I think the body, combined with the circumstances around him, suggest murder very strongly. So let me present the theory to you, and you'll see how the mummy plays a central role. Carter finally gets the mummy out. How? He calls in an anatomist from Cairo, from the School of Medicine in Cairo. His name is Derry. And Derry cuts the mummy into pieces. Never publishes that he did this. He saws the mummy in half, right at the 4th lumbar vertebra. Comes right in. Now, this is a horrible thing to do to a pharaoh's body. I guarantee you that if they had found the golden throne of Tutankhamun stuck in this oil, they would have figured out a way to get it out, find the right solvents, dissolve it, and they wouldn't have sawed it in half. But in these days, nobody realized how much information was in a mummy. Nobody realized it was an important artifact. It was just a body. They were more interested in the more than 100 gold amulets and objects within the wrappings. So they sawed it apart and took the body out. Now, what did they learn from the body? First, Tutankhamun was a boy king. This is the first time we learn that he dies at around the age of 18. Now, how do you know he dies at the age of 18? Many ways. First, the long bones of your body, the epiphyses, as we call them, the ends of the epiphyses. The ends are called the epiphyses. The long bones are like your femur, you know, the longest leg bone in your body. There's the tibia, the fibula, right? Arm bones. When you're young, the ends of them, the epiphyses, are cartilage. It's soft material that's not fully attached. This is why kids are very flexible. You know, they can bend because they've got a lot of cartilage. As you get older, it ossifies, turns to bone, and becomes more solid and more fixed to the end of the bone. We could see the ends of Tutankhamun's bones, and they're still cartilage. So he's about 18. It's just about ossifying. He's about 18. Another thing that Derry talks about is the molars haven't erupted, right? When do the molars erupt? He doesn't have a full set of molars coming down. So he's before the age of, say, 19 or 20. Now, one interesting question that I have that Derry never answers when he wrote up his report, how does Derry see the molars of Tutankhamun? How did he know that the molars aren't down? The mouth is closed. He didn't x-ray him. Tell you what I think he did. And I've kind of looked at them. I think Derry made a slit over here, right underneath the chin, I'd say, right? Right underneath the chin. And he pulls the flap down and looks inside, sees the molars aren't descended, and then he glues it back up and never says a word. He is taking apart this body piece by piece in a kind of very, very rough way. But this, at least, teaches us that Tutankhamun is a boy king. Now, let's go back and figure out, how does he become king? You'll remember he is the son of Akhenaten, born at Tel El Amarna, that religious center in the desert. When he is born of a minor wife, so he's not pure royal. But when Akhenaten dies, his father dies in year 17, there are only two royal children alive. Tutankhaten, who is half royal, and his half-sister, Ankhesenaten, who's about the same age, 10. They're about 10 years old when they're orphaned. And she is pure royal blood. Now remember, how do you become king of Egypt? By marrying the right woman. The only half-royal male is married to his half-sister, the only pure royal female, and becomes king of Egypt at the age of 10. Now, he's 10 years old. He is not making decisions for himself. Somebody has got to be calling the shots. 10 years old, at Tel El Amarna, the pharaoh, the religious leader, is dead. What do? Do you continue with the old religion, worshiping the Aten, and stay at Amarna? Or you give it up, go back to the old ways, polytheism, many gods, and move back to Thebes? The decision was made. They moved back to Thebes. So Tutankhaten changes his name to Tutankhamun, going back to the old god Amun. Ankhesenaten changes her name to Ankhesenamun. And these two 10-year-old children, married to each other, move back to Thebes. Now, think of what it must have been like for these children. When I think of them, I try to think of them as people. That's what I want to get through this course, that these are people, not just pharaohs. These were scared children. They were orphans. I mean, I often think of them as children of a bad divorce, in a sense, you know. I think they've got each other to cling to. They have lost their parents. They have lost their names. They have lost the only city they ever knew. They are being transported from their city to Thebes, the religious capital of Egypt, to a new religion, and everybody's saying their father was a heretic and terrible. It must have been horrible for these children. And somebody is making the decisions for them. Who? I think it's the man who was the vizier of Egypt at the time, a man named Ai, A-Y-E, Ai. He's an advisor to Akhenaten. He's a senior official, and he moves back to Thebes with them. So they move back to Thebes, this young couple, 10 years old, people making decisions for them, and they start a new life. They do all the right things politically. The first thing Tutankhamun does as a 10-year-old, he's a king, he has to build his tomb. But he doesn't build it in the main drag of the Valley of the Kings. He builds it in a side valley off the Valley of the Kings, where his grandfather, Amenhotep III, had built his tomb. Because he's saying, I'm like my grandfather, the traditionalist. I'm like grandpa, not like my father. So he builds near his grandfather. The next thing he does, remember pharaohs like to build? He's 10 years old. What is he going to build? Right? The answer is, when Amenhotep III died, his grandfather, there was a monument left unfinished at Luxor Temple, right in Thebes. He built the temple but never decorated it. Akhenaten, you remember, moves the whole capital. He's not going to decorate anything in Thebes. So Tutankhamun's first monument is decorating Grandpa's temple. And what does he put on it? The most traditional religious festival in all of Egypt, the Opet festival. This was a festival, it was a time of feasting, drinking, eating, all paid for by the government. The statues of the gods from Karnak Temple, a mile and a half outside of Luxor, were brought to Luxor Temple, where they would stay for a fortnight, and everybody would feast. And it was Amun, Mut, and Khansu were the three gods, the trinity of Egypt, and everybody would feast and have a great time. Tutankhamun shows it on the walls, the Opet Festival. Again, he's saying, I'm a traditionalist. So things are going fairly well for these two kids. They are bringing back the old religion to Egypt. They must have been very popular. Now, you remember I said, I'm going to try to suggest that Tutankhamun was murdered. Why would anybody murder him? Well, let me say how I came to this theory. Derry's examination of the mummy of Tutankhamun was not the only one. Not the only one. Later, in the 1960s, Tutankhamun was x-rayed. Now, the mummy has never left the tomb because it is the only pharaoh's body found intact in a tomb in the Valley of the Kings. The Egyptian government decided when they moved all the treasures out of the tomb, they would leave the mummy inside the sarcophagus. It's still there. Tourists don't know it. You can't see it, but it's in the sarcophagus. And in the 1960s, a portable x-ray machine was brought in, and the mummy was x-rayed. About 10 years ago, I was watching a documentary on TV about Tutankhamun. And the man who x-rayed Tutankhamun was talking about the skull x-ray. And I remember him vividly saying, and if you look over here on the x-ray, and he's pointing to a spot in the back of the skull, it looks like there may have been a blow to the back of the head here. And this, in turn, could have caused a buildup of blood pressure, which in turn could have caused death. So he's saying there seems to be a blow to the back of the head, which could have caused death. Far from murder. Far from murder. But I think that if you know the circumstances surrounding Tutankhamun's death, the circumstantial evidence, it all leads to murder. And let me explain. We now know that Tutankhamun dies at the age of 18. What does his widow do, Ankhesenamun? Right? She's widowed. She is the only royal person alive now. Whom will she marry? Who will become king of Egypt? She does something totally unheard of. She writes a letter to the enemy, the Hittite king. Now, the Hittites were one of the traditional enemies of Egypt. And the letter is so bizarre that the Hittite king does not believe it. She says, my husband has died. I have no sons. They say that you have many sons. Send me a prince, I will marry him and make him king of Egypt. Never will I marry a servant of mine. I am afraid. Very strange letter. The queen of Egypt is afraid? Of whom? And what does it mean? Never will I marry a servant of mine. A commoner? And why is she writing to the Hittite king? Aren't there plenty of eligible Egyptian noblemen, maybe? Very strange. The king does not believe it. He's never heard anything like it, and he sends an ambassador to Egypt to see if it's true. The ambassador comes back and says it's true. The queen is widowed. There's no one marrying her. The prince is sent. Finally. And we know what happens to the prince, because we have the letters in the archives. The prince is murdered on the borders of Egypt before he enters. He is killed. What happens next? If you want to know what happens next, look on the walls of Tutankhamun's tomb. It's almost like a photograph of the burial of Tutankhamun. On the wall of Tutankhamun's tomb is a picture of a ceremony being performed on his mummy. It's called the opening of the mouth, so that Tutankhamun can speak and breathe again in the next world. An implement is touched to the mouth by a high priest, a little wooden implement called an adze, to open the mouth ceremonially. And we see Tutankhamun wrapped as a mummy, kind of dressed like the god Osiris, god of the dead, and the ceremony is being performed on him. Now, who is performing that ceremony? The person performing a ceremony is wearing a leopard skin. He's a high priest. But that's not all he's wearing. He is wearing the crown of a pharaoh. The next pharaoh is painted on the walls of Tutankhamun's tomb, performing the opening of the mouth ceremony. And who is the next pharaoh. I, the vizier of Egypt. Somehow I has become king of Egypt, while Ankhesenamun is writing to the Hittite king and saying, send me a prince. How does I become king of Egypt? The answer is in a finger ring, which was found by an Egyptologist in the 1930s named Newberry. And on the finger ring is a double cartouche, two ovals showing the names of Ankhesenamun, the widow of Tutankhamun, and I. They've been married. Newberry recognized that this means that I, a commoner, has married Tutankhamun's widow, right? Now, think about what the chronology must have been. She's writing to the Hittite king, and I is painting himself on the tomb simultaneously as the next king, right? Now, what happens to Ankhesenamun? She was afraid. She might have realized that Tutankhamun was murdered. Blow to the back of the head, perhaps. What happens to her? The answer is she disappears from history. The last thing we ever hear about Ankhesenamun is this finger ring. She has married I becomes king, and Ankhesenamun disappears from history. We don't even have her tomb. One of the things that Newberry wondered, and I wondered, is what about I's tomb? Is Ankhesenamun shown in I's tomb? She's the queen who makes him king. She is the Hemet Weret, the great wife. Is she shown there? Well, Newberry wrote to Carter and said, Carter, go to I's tomb and see if her cartouche is there. See if Ankhesenamun is on the wall. I don't know if Carter ever did go to I's tomb and look, but I did. And there is no sign of Ankhesenamun. There is a cartouche and a queen, but the cartouche is very short, and Ankhesenamun's name is very long, Ankhesenamun. I's first wife, from Tel El Amarna, from the good old days, was named T, a very short name. So he's got his first wife depicted as the Queen of Egypt, and Ankhesenamun has disappeared totally from history. Now, we don't even have her tomb. Nothing of her has ever been found. Now think about it. And remember I said this is just a theory. It's a murder theory, but I think it's reasonable. What would happen if we have a man is dead at the age of 18, blow to the back of the head. His widow writes, saying, I'm afraid, never will I marry a commoner. We then discover that she marries a commoner, and then she disappears from history. I think it's true to say that there would have been an investigation at least. Now, I don't think that I've proven that Tutankhamun was murdered, but let me say what I think is the scenario. I has always been calling the shots for the young children, the vizier. But now Tutankhamun's 18, so is Ankhesenamun, about the age where perhaps he can rule by himself, where he doesn't need I anymore. Ankhesenamun has given birth twice. There are two fetuses inside the tomb of Tutankhamun. Two fetuses, two miscarriages that were buried with them. So we know she's of childbearing age, and if the next one survives, we have a new king of Egypt, and I will no longer be needed. So I think I sees that this is his chance to become king of Egypt, and he better act quickly. So Tutankhamun is somehow dispatched by a blow to the back of the head. Ankhesenamun writes to the Hittite king. The prince we know for sure is murdered. We have the records. And this can't be an easy thing to do. The prince is coming with an entourage. This is the Hittite prince who's going to be king of Egypt. He's murdered. That's one murder for sure. Ankhesenamun disappears from history after saying, I'm afraid. And all of a sudden, I is king of Egypt. I think it's reasonable to think that perhaps Tutankhamun was murdered at the age of 18, and maybe even his widow was murdered. Now, I like to think that there's justice in the world. There is an ancient Egyptian saying that to say the name of the dead is to make them live again. I disappears from history, a minor king. He only rules for another 2 years. He's an old man. He's 70, perhaps, when he becomes king. So he disappears, and nobody knows about him. And the one pharaoh, whose name everyone knows, is Tutankhamun. So maybe in a sense, he's the one who lives again. I'll see you next time.